In this extract, we're going to have a look at an extract from Chapter 3, the second part of Chapter 3. Our objective there is to understand and analyse the writer's use of language. And there's two things we're going to be having as a written outcome, and obviously we're also going to read the chapter. Now for this bit, I've put together a reading of that section. Obviously you don't have to listen to that. If you want, you can just scroll through and see the words on screen. As I turn to go back down the steps at 212 6th Street, the front door swings open to reveal a woman in a damp apron, a broom in her hand, looking at me with narrow, suspicious eyes. "You want something?" she asks. I wonder if she's using the broom as a weapon for protection, and I don't blame her. I have to keep reminding myself how I look to other people. "Do you know where the Renards went?" Not expecting an answer, but hoping that the question provides me with respectability. "What?" she asks, frowning as she clutches the broom in front of her. The scarf has muffled my voice, of course. "The Renards," I say, trying to pronounce the words distinctly. "Where are they?" "All gone," she says, her voice doleful. "All gone." She begins sweeping the doorstep as if she intends to sweep me away too. Her words chase me down the steps and into the street. All gone, all gone. Mrs. Belander is waiting when I return from 3rd Street, 2 bags of groceries from Henholt Market in my arms. I have stocked up on cocoa and bread and strawberry jam and a variety of Campbell's soups in the red and white cans, mostly tomato and bean and pea soup. Everything's soft because my gums are tender and it's hard for me to chew. I have also bought 2 bottles of pasteurised milk, a pound of butter and a wedge of cheddar cheese, which I will store in the small electric refrigerator on the counter upstairs. I can keep going on a minimum of food because I lost my appetite somewhere in France and eat now only to sustain myself for a while. Mrs. Belander holds a deep pot in her hands and says, "I will carry it up for you, the black bean soup I made." We climb the stairs together. In the tenement, I place the groceries on the counter and she puts the pot on the stove. "No boil," she says, "just heat." Then turns to me. "You didn't say your name." Not quite an accusation, but as if her feelings have been hurt. Here is the point where my life becomes a lie. "Raymond," I tell her, using the name of my dead brother. "Beaumont," I add, my mother's name before she married my father. "Père et mère?" she asks. I am ready to give those answers. In Canada. In my mind, a substitute heaven for Canada. We lived in Boston before, but they went back home to Canada when the war came. The truth is that my Uncle Louis, who never became a citizen, returned to Canada while I was in the army. I see the question in her eyes and am quick to answer. I met a Frenchtown boy in the service, Norman Rochelot. He told me about Frenchtown. He made it sound like a nice place to live. Doubt flashes in her eyes, and I make a quick addition to my story. My mother and father are waiting for me in Canada, but I have to report to Fort Delta for treatments for a while. It scares me how easy it is to lie. "Vous parlez français?" she asks. I shake my head. No. I can understand French because of the 8 years with the sisters at St. Jude's, but have never been able to speak the language correctly. She sighs heavily, studies my scarf and bandage for a long moment and murmurs, "Poor boy," again, as she shuffles towards the door. The tenement is heated only by the black stove in the kitchen, fed by a glass oil jug that I'll have to fill every day or two from the big metal barrel in the backyard. The stove throws heat only into a small area of the kitchen, and the rest of the tenement is damp with cold, even though winter is gone. I make myself a cup of cocoa, stalling, delaying the moment of going to bed, despite the cold. The clock on the wall, in the shape of a banjo, tells me it is 25 minutes after 11, which means that a long night stretches ahead. I yearn for sleep, my eyes raw and burning, but I know that the dreams will begin when I close my eyes and drift off. In the bathroom, I apply more Vaseline to my cheeks. Finally, I slip into bed. Mrs. Belander has provided me with extra blankets, and I pull them up to my chin. I double a pillow under my head to prevent the phlegm from running down my throat, causing me to choke and cough. I can never trace the moment when I finally fall asleep, that blurred line between wakefulness and oblivion. While waiting, I silently recite the names of the guys in my platoon, Richards and Eisenberg and Chambers and, yes, Smith. And their first names or nicknames. Eddie and Irwin and Blinky and Jack. Then more names. Johnson and Orlandi and Riley and O'Brien. And their first names. Henry and Sonny and Spooks and Billy. And then start all over again. Arranging them this time into alphabetical order. Still waiting for sleep to come. I don't want to think about them. Those GIs in my platoon. I don't want to recite the names. I want to forget what happened there in France, but every night the recitation begins, like a litany. The names of the GIs, like beads on a rosary. I close my eyes and see them advancing in scattered groups through the abandoned village, ruined homes and debris-cluttered streets, our rifles ready, late afternoon shadows obscuring the windows and doorways and alley entrances. We are all tense and nervous and scared because the last village seemed peaceful and vacant until sudden gunfire from snipers erupted in the windows and doorways and cut down the advance patrol just ahead of our platoon. Now I can hear Barry Johnson's ragged breathing and Blinky Chambers whistling between his teeth. The village too still, too quiet. Jesus, Sonny Lundy mutters. Jesus, meaning I'm scared and so is everybody else. Clenched fists holding firearms, quiet curses floating on the air, grunts and hisses and farts, not like the war movies at the Plymouth, nobody displaying heroics or bravado. We are probably taking the final steps of our lives in this village, whose name we don't even know, and other villages are waiting ahead of us, and Eddie Richards asks of nobody in particular, what the hell are we doing here anyway? And he's clutching his stomach because he's had diarrhea for 3 days, carrying the stink with him all the time, so everybody has been avoiding his presence. Now gunfire erupts, and at the same time artillery shells, theirs or ours, boom in the air and explode around us. We run for cover, scrambling and scurrying, hitting the dirt, trying to become part of the buildings themselves. I'm not safe anywhere. I find myself in a narrow alley, groping through rising dust, and 2 German soldiers in white uniforms appear like grim ghosts, rifles coming up. But my automatic is too quick, and the head of one of the soldiers explodes like a ripe tomato, and the other cries, "Mama," as my gunfire cuts him in half, both halves of him tumbling to the ground. I explode into wakefulness along with the booming artillery, and I find myself gasping, instantly wide-eyed, not cold for once in Mrs. Bellander's tenement, the sweat warm on my flesh, but in a minute the sweat turns icy. In the alley that day I encountered the German soldiers all right, but my bursts of gunfire killed the soldiers quickly. No exploding head, no body cut in two, although one of them did cry "Mama" as he fell. When I looked down at them, in one of those eerie pauses that happens in an attack, a sudden silence that's even more terrible than exploding shells, I saw how young they were. Boys with apple cheeks, too young to shave. Like me. "Hey, Francis, come on," yells Eddie Richards, and I join him in a scramble out of the alley and into the woods. His smell still heavy in the air, and we stumble around in the woods until night time, when we run across the remains of our platoon and learn that Jack Smith and Billy O'Brien are dead, and Henry Johnson wounded, his chest ripped open by shrapnel, carried off somewhere behind the lines, and we never see him again. The next day, the grenade blows off my face. The morning sun slashes my eyelids, and I blink at daylight spilling through the window. I have survived another night, endured the dreams and the memories again, although I'm not sure anymore which are dreams and which are memories. My limbs are stiff and the raw places of my flesh sting, but I grope from the bed, coughing, my throat filled with phlegm. Ignore it all, I tell yourself. Count your blessings. You're back in Frenchtown and your body is functioning. You have a nice dry place to stay and a mission to perform. And maybe this will be the day that Larry LaSalle will appear on the streets of Frenchtown, and you'll be able to carry out that mission. The main part of the lesson, we've asked you to annotate 2 to 4 quotes from the extract and to give us some detailed analysis of how the writer is using language. As you can see, there are some bullet points there which give you some prompts about that and the things that you could talk about. Here's the extract. So I thought I'd give you a few hints and a bit of discussion about some of the things that I would look at and I would talk about if I was giving an answer. Firstly, at the beginning of the extract, we have gunfire erupting. Now, eruption is a word with a great deal of very interesting connotations. It obviously links into volcanoes, so to a violent action, but also one that's almost inescapable. So we could talk about the eruption being almost inescapable, something which creates an incredible urgency, and that links in very nicely to the next detail that I've picked out there. Driven by this, they run for cover, scrambling and scurrying, hitting the dirt. That sequence of active verbs there, run, scrambling, scurrying, hitting, all convey this sense of not just urgency but absolute desperation. These are people who are running for their lives, probably not for the first time in the day. They have already in this extract talked about the presence of death and about their experiences in another village. So at this point, it's a repetition of that, and already these are people who are incredibly tense under a huge amount of pressure, and their actions illustrate that. Now, the description of the two German soldiers is really very interesting. Quite a lot of this is to do with the use of colour imagery. They're described as being in white uniforms. White is conventionally used to symbolise things like purity and innocence. And at first, that seems slightly at odds with who they're describing here. However, if you think about how this extract goes on, where he ends up looking down at them and seeing their youth, their innocence, they're described as looking like apples, fruit, ripe, young, and clearly white here perhaps could have those sorts of connotations. It's quite a contrast there between the role that they're thrust into. Similarly, grim ghosts. Ghosts, of course, could be a sense of foreshadowing what's about to happen to them. Then, of course, there is the actual death here, which is described as the head of one of the soldiers explodes like a ripe tomato. That's a vivid and brutal image. Obviously, it's used for simile. That's the technique that's used there. But I think it's particularly apt because of the visual image that it gives us. The colour. This is red. It's red. It's messy. It's uncontrolled. It's incredibly violent. It's direct. It's to the point. And again, the effect on the reader there, we could talk about being shocking. We can see the raw brutality of war and the terrible waste that there is. Hopefully you can use these little hints and take some of that and put that into your annotations. So going back to the task, remember that we're looking for at least 2 quotes from that extract that we've given you. We're looking for those comments on the overall effect. So the overall effect that it has on the reader, on what the writer is intending to do. When you're talking about the connotations of specific words and phrases, try to offer more than one alternative. If we're saying that the word has an effect of conveying a sense of brutality, you could also double it or triple it. Brutality, violence, inhumanity. Remember that English language in particular is a very discursive subject, so sometimes explaining your ideas in a little bit more detail and chucking in a little bit of that modal language, that tentative language, this could, this might, this may, will really help you to flesh out and develop those answers.